So, good afternoon and welcome to the second event as part of the Artificial Intelligence Webinar Week brought to you by the National Academic Integrity Network, or NAIN, and QQI. My name is Aisling Reist, and as well as being the Head of Quality Enhancement at the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences, I sit on the NAIN Steering Committee, and therefore I'm delighted to host this afternoon's webinar. It's really wonderful to see the really high numbers of people who've joined today's event. I think the level of interest in this week's webinars is testimony to the perceived potential impact of artificial intelligence, not only in our lives in general, but particularly in higher education and specifically on assessment. Our speaker today is hopefully going to unpack some of this. Professor Phil Newton is a neuroscientist at Swansea University Medical School. In addition to teaching neuroscience, he also teaches evidence-based education. His research interests include teaching and assessment, with a particular focus on academic integrity, and he is widely published in this area. Very shortly, I'm going to pass over to Phil for his presentation, after which I'll probe him with some of the questions that are arising today. So if you'd like to ask a question, please pop it in the chat box and I'll summarise this for Phil later in the webinar. Today's event poses the question, online exams in the age of ChatGPT, now what? I think this is the question we've all been asking. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Phil and pass over to him to start his presentation. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you so much, Aisling. I hope you can all hear me. I'll tell you right now, I don't know what the answer is. And I think that's probably part of the main message that I hope people are able to take away from this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by telling you a story, who I am and how I've come to be sat here in this webinar. It's lovely to see so many people here. I recognize what Aisling has said. There's clearly a strong interest in this topic, and I've been working on it for a little while now, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned some lessons the hard way. And what I'm going to do is share some of those lessons with you in the hope that it can make it easier for you to avoid having to learn them the hard way, the same way I've done. And also because I think it illustrates another one of the key things that I hope people are able to take away, or some of the key messages. It'll help me explain them later on. So the origin story for this work is a project, or three projects, that we started last summer in the era that we might call pre-GPT. And we put together a research team, myself, my colleague Michael Draper, and the student researchers you see here. And we were trying to do three projects. We did three projects looking at the integrity of online exams. And the reason we were doing those projects was because I felt like just as little as a year ago, all of the good learning that we had done during COVID, and about how to teach online, about how to assess online, all the things we had told ourselves about how higher education was never going to be the same again, and we had to make sure that we captured all of the good learning that we'd done. It felt to me like a lot of that was slipping through our fingers, and we were very quickly going back to business as usual to some extent. And that, I think, is a problem, because online education is really important. It opens up access to education to people who might not otherwise be able to get to it. And yet, if we can't do the assessments right, we can't do the education right. And so we were looking to try and build on what had happened during COVID and make some recommendations for how we might do online exams in the future. And I'm showing you their pictures because I want to thank them for all the work that they did. And in particular, Myra there in the top left, because the project that she and I did has been smashed to pieces by ChatGPT. Bits of it are still standing, but a lot of it is a smouldering ruin. But I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because it's important, I think. What we were trying to do, Myra and I, is we were trying to write some practical, useful, pragmatic guidance for individual educators to help them write higher order learning multiple choice questions. So multiple choice questions that assess higher order learning. The reasons for that were, first of all, that multiple choice questions get a lot of bad press about only being able to assess recall and factual knowledge. They're actually very good at assessing higher order learning, problem solving, critical thinking, and so on, as long as they're written correctly. But that's not easy to do. So what we were doing was taking all the good research which showed that multiple choice questions could do this if they were done properly, and turning that into a simple set of guidance, a checklist, if you like, for educators to be able to use, to put it into their hands and make it easy for them. The second reason we were doing this was our hypothesis was that if we did this, if we wrote this guidance and then we wrote questions using this guidance, it would be harder for people to cheat on exams that contained these questions that had been written using our guidance. Now, to cut a long and painful story short, it worked. It worked really well back in the days when cheating in online exams meant going onto Google or sharing messages through WhatsApp or whatever. And that really is the beginning then of why I said, yes, let's come and talk about online exams in a webinar for QQI. There's a lot of useful things that we can say. So back in the summer of 2022, we were working on this, and the project worked really well, and we were writing it up. And during that process, on November the 30th, 2022, ChatGPT sneaked and then quickly erupted into the public consciousness. Now, at the time, in those early days, just a few short months ago, most of the chat about ChatGPT was the thought that it would be able to do academic writing. It would be able to write essays. It would put contract cheating essay mills out of business, and that we needed to pay attention to our coursework and our essays and the impact that ChatGPT would have on them. And that is all still correct. At the time, then, Myra and I were quite reassured by this, because it seemed to make the case even stronger for the use of an alternative form of assessment to assess higher order learning. And we thought that our guidance for MCQs would be able to fill that gap. And so at Christmas, we gave ourselves a Christmas present and we submitted this paper about how this guidance and how it would make it harder to cheat in online exams. And for about 6 weeks, we were very pleased with ourselves. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I was proud of what we achieved here, and I still am. You know, it was a really good project. It worked really well, but it didn't last long, that warm glow that we had from submitting the paper and feeling like we had done something useful, because in late January and early February, we started to see the preprint papers and then the subsequent news stories, which showed that actually ChatGPT is really good at answering higher order multiple choice questions of the type that we had written. This is just one headline from many that emerged at around that time, showing that in this case, ChatGPT could pass the United States medical licensing exam, very complicated, sophisticated, higher order multiple choice question based exam, and there were similar findings in law and so on. So back to the drawing board. And what I then did over the next 6 weeks or so was I read all of those papers and there are about 30 of them, which had taken some form of multiple choice based exam, fed it to ChatGPT to see how well that it did, and then written up their findings. And I then wrote a second paper, which I was finalizing on the morning of March the 14th, just 2 weeks ago. This is actually the second iteration of that second paper, where I had reviewed ChatGPT's performance on exams that were based on multiple choice questions. And the punchline at the time, on the morning of March the 14th, was, although ChatGPT is quite good at these exams, it's not brilliant. And there are clearly some things that we can do that would make it harder for ChatGPT to pass these exams, and so would make it harder, if we were using these sorts of exams in an online format, would make it harder for students to cheat if they had access to ChatGPT. So as the train pulled into Paddington Station, I was on an early morning train, I should have said. I was on my way to a HE event in London organised by Wonk HE, and I was making the use of this time on the train, as one does, to write up this paper. And the paper was done as I arrived in London. And fast forward about 3 hours, and I'm on stage at this Wonk HE event, and I'm asked, I'm presenting some of the findings, and I'm asked about ChatGPT, and I said, look, folks, don't worry. It's okay. I did the analysis on the train this morning. Clearly, ChatGPT is something we need to pay attention to. It's going to have a big disruption, but there are things that we can do, particularly with these online exams and MCQs. I finished the paper this morning. I'm going to submit it on the train on the way home, and it's going to be okay. Fast forward then just a few more hours, and I'm on the 7:48 train from London back to Swansea, and I'm poised to submit this paper. But my phone has been buzzing away in my pocket as I've made my way on the tube back across London. And that often does, doesn't it? When you go to a conference, you get lots of connections. People on LinkedIn want to be your friend. They've heard you talk, they've seen the work, they want to connect, and that's a really positive thing that we do at these conferences. But that was not what the messages were all about on this particular evening. Instead, it was people sending me a message to say, look, I saw your presentation, I like the work, thank you, but have you seen the new ChatGPT? And it turns out that at the exact same time that I was on stage in London to an audience of a few hundred people saying, look, don't worry, keep calm and carry on, it's going to be all right. The people that make ChatGPT were themselves on stage on a live YouTube stream to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, unveiling the new ChatGPT. And whereas the old ChatGPT was okay at online multiple choice questions, the new ChatGPT was really, really good. And this is an image from their technical report, and we don't have to go through the details, but you can see there are lots of different exams there along the bottom on the x-axis. And the performance of the old ChatGPT in blue, ranging from very bad to very good, and in green is the improvement in performance with the new ChatGPT. So they had specifically tested how good ChatGPT is at these MCQ-based exams, and they had improved the performance of their new product, and it specifically did the thing that I had told everyone that it couldn't. Now, it's tempting, although supremely arrogant, of course, to think that they had specifically done this to ruin my day, but ruin my day it did. And I sank back into my chair, literally and figuratively, and I thought to myself, I don't know what we're going to do. What are we going to do? And specifically, I am going to give a webinar less than 2 weeks from now with QQI, and I now have no idea what I'm going to say. So I treated myself to using a different AI tool, and I made a picture of a professor sitting on a train experiencing an existential crisis, which was me on that 7:48 train, and reflected on what it was we were going to say and what the impact is going to be for higher education. As a brief aside, an entirely different but important set of challenges. This particular AI tool, I asked it to make 10 different pictures of a professor sitting on a train experiencing an existential crisis, and every single one of them was a middle-aged white man, which speaks to a whole different set of challenges that we're going to encounter when it comes to using these tools in our everyday lives. So, lots of disruption has been thrust upon us in education and in life. And for every disruption that's actually happened, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that are predicted. And so there's a lot written about how to manage, how to prepare for, and how to thrive in significant disruption. And one of the things that's written that I have found very helpful these last 2 weeks is to never lose sight of what your core values are. What are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? What does the long-standing evidence base say is the good way to do it? And hold on to that. And in this case, let ChatGPT come to that rather than doing as I've done, chasing ChatGPT all over the place, trying to work out what it can do and update every 10 minutes with that and every other AI tool. So the core values that I think are important for me personally, and then also I think for us to deal with these challenges. The first of those is pragmatism. My research is all anchored in the philosophical paradigm of pragmatism. Pragmatism itself simply says that in order that when we're doing research, we should try and ask questions whose answers are useful and whose answers find meaning in terms of their concrete consequences for the real world. So we could sit here for an hour and just show you amazing examples of what these tools can do, and then be horrified about what this means for us. But I'm going to try my best to be pragmatic and to be useful. And also then the other second core value is to stick to the evidence. The evidence is updating in real time, but specifically probably to separate out the evidence from the hyperbole and the media headlines, and in particular the evidence around what makes a good assessment. We've known for a long time what makes a good assessment, and that if we don't do certain things, that makes it a poor assessment. And that is true with academic integrity as well as all of the other reasons why we do a good assessment. And that hasn't changed since November 2022 or March the 14th, 2023. A good assessment is still a good assessment. And then the fourth core value, which I'm going to use for the rest of this session, comes from the literature on academic integrity. And what it proposes is that if we want people to act with integrity, which hopefully we do, then we've got to make it easy for them to do so. And in addition to making it easier for them to do so, that involves making it harder for them to not do so. So we're very good in higher education, I think, about wanting to help people do the right thing, to promote trust and integrity and so on. But we often find it uncomfortable to think about making it harder to do the wrong thing. And yet we can't really have one without the other, especially because what ChatGPT does is it makes it so easy for people to do the wrong thing. That's actually where I'm going to start with this basic principle. I'm going to show you some data from the start. I'm not going to start. I've started, obviously. It's where we're going to get back to where I thought we were going to be when we originally agreed to do this webinar. And that's some data from one of the other projects that we did back in the summer. Now, this project was simply trying to quantify how common cheating is in online exams. And the reason we were doing that is because there was a lot written in the media and elsewhere during lockdowns about a supposed epidemic of cheating in university assessments and in particular in online exams. And we wanted to know actually what does the evidence say, and also just to establish a baseline figure for what the levels of cheating are in online exams. Now, we didn't generate any primary data ourselves. We did a systematic review. There are lots of studies out there that have tried to measure cheating. That's hard to do. So what they normally do is some sort of self-report survey where they ask people some version of a question: have you ever cheated in an online exam? And we simply identified all the survey studies that we could and aggregated the findings together. And there are three things I want to tell you about the results. This graph shows you two of them. The dark graph shows the level of cheating in the studies that were conducted before COVID. And you can see that about a quarter to a third of students were willing to admit in a self-report survey that they had cheated in an online exam. And the first thing to note there, I think, is that I was surprised by how high that was. Perhaps even more surprising is the level to which that then jumped in the studies that were conducted during COVID, to the extent that in the studies we reviewed, more students were willing to admit to cheating than not cheating. Now, I want to give you a health warning. These findings, this analysis is not finished going through peer review. There is a preprint, which I'll show you a link to at the end, where you can look at the analysis for yourself. But I'm fairly confident that the qualitative finding here, that baseline levels of self-report of cheating in online exams is quite high and went up a lot during COVID. I think that's unlikely to change, even if the absolute numbers are subject to some variance, in part because another part of the health warning is that it's quite difficult to accurately measure cheating in online exams or cheating in any format, and so we have to rely on self-report, which has a lot of problems. There are also some other differences between these two groups which may explain some of the variance, but like I said, I think the main finding is going to stand. The third thing that I wanted to show you was the main reason I wanted to show you this, which was that many of these survey studies asked students some version of a question: why did you cheat? If you cheated in an online exam, why was it that you were cheating? And what we did is, very simply, to cut a long story short, coded all of the responses that we found in those studies. And the most common response to why did I cheat was the answer: because I could, because it was easy for me to cheat. Now, this might seem fairly straightforward and intuitive, but it speaks to that core value that I mentioned earlier on, and I think is really important when we consider the potential impact of ChatGPT and similar tools. It makes it really easy for students to do the wrong thing, and it sets off, as we found in these studies, some thought processes that explain perhaps what we need to think about when we're setting up our online exams and the consequences of ChatGPT. Students reported that they cheated because they could, and then if it was easy for them to cheat, that told them two things. It told them that perhaps their university didn't value the integrity and security of the exam. It told them not to go on Google or to share answers using WhatsApp, but it made no effort to stop them. And if it was so easy for them to cheat, then the second thing it communicated to the students was, if I can cheat, then so can everybody else. And if it's easy for me to cheat, then everybody else is going to cheat. And so I'm actually going to be at a disadvantage if I don't cheat. I would be a fool not to. To be clear, I'm not saying that all students are cheats and that they're all motivated by terrible, nefarious intent. I'm saying they're human beings and they make decisions based upon what's placed in front of them. And just like we do when we're driving on the motorway or in any other situation, if it's very easy for us to do the wrong thing and there are limited consequences, then we're much more likely to do it than if it's harder for us to do the wrong thing and it's easier for us to do the right thing. Okay, we've got 20 minutes in and we haven't talked actually about what ChatGPT is. So I'm going to do that briefly now. I'm going to assume that there's a broad range of experience in the audience, from people who've nerded out on it for the last few weeks through to people who know nothing about it but have just heard a lot of talk about it and so want to come along to hear a bit more. And I'll explain it on the basis of that latter, that people don't know much about it. However, I want to be clear, I am not a computer scientist. I am not an AI expert, where AI stands for artificial intelligence. I am a nerd, and proudly so. I'm a neuroscientist, so I know a bit about how people learn, but I don't know the technical basis for how ChatGPT works. However, what I have found is, in the explanations I've read and listened to, actually what it does is fairly simple. It's pretty straightforward to understand, and I found it useful to do that, so I'm going to share that with you. ChatGPT, there are three things that we need to unpack. And the first part is the chat part of ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is basically a chatbot, a very sophisticated and amazing chatbot, but just like the ones that you use when you go to complain or ask questions about your Wi-Fi or your electricity bill, it's a chatbot designed to chat with you, and it's built upon this GPT technology. What it means then is that GPT technology can be used to build many other things, and it is already, as you'll see. The GPT part stands for generative and pre-trained transformer. The generative part means that it generates text rather than predicting whether something is right or wrong or black or white or diseased or not or something. It generates content. And the way that it does that, very simply, is it just puts one word in front of another. So if it has laid down the words Ireland is a, then it would be logical for it to then for the next words to be something like country in Europe or country on the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, something like that. It would be illogical for the next words to be lawnmower or caterpillar or something like that. So it lays one word down in front of another by making a calculation about what is most likely to come next. And the basis for the calculation is the text upon which it has been trained. And the latest version, GPT-4, has been trained on basically everything that human beings have ever written, ever, all of the internet and books and so on. And so that's where it gets its enormous power from. So it can essentially analyze all of that content, make a prediction about what word is likely to come next based upon everything that it's seen before, and plonk that word down and then do the same thing over and over and over again. So when you ask it a question, it analyzes what you've written and then again makes that calculation about what word would be most likely to come in a response. That also tells us a couple of things about what it doesn't do. It doesn't learn. It doesn't create new knowledge necessarily. It generates text on the basis of a large amount of language, which is where you may have heard the term large language model. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some examples of what it can do, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on that for reasons that I think are important. And I've already told you some of the things that we think that it can't yet do. Before I show you what it can do, I just want to flag up the fact that flag up that there's a typo on my own slide. It shows you that I've had to start again, doesn't it? When we rate an assessment as higher order or lower order, not aura, or when any academic is asked about an assessment and to make an evaluation of it, in particular, whether it's hard or easy or higher order or lower order, the answer that we give about that sort of rating is influenced largely, if not completely, by whether or not we personally can answer it. So if we think we can answer an assessment, then we tend to think it's easy and that other people will be able to answer it. The flip side to that is I want to show you ChatGPT doing things that are difficult, which it can do. But if I show you assessments that are very hard, i.e. from complex neuroscience or neurology or something, then if we see an assessment that's from a very specialist field, then we also tend to disregard the potential consequences of that for our own field. So the answer to that is for me to show you assessments that anyone can understand, but they will then necessarily be perceived as slightly easier. Nothing we can do about this bias other than for me to make you aware of it. All right. The first thing I'm going to show you, which is the thing that really did it for me on my train back from London to Swansea 2 weeks ago, is from the OpenAI live stream where they asked ChatGPT to build a website, which in itself is quite a remarkable thing that it's able to do. What's perhaps more remarkable, the instructions that they gave it to be able to build that website, which is shown here. What I'm going to show you is, I'm actually going to show you a video of them doing this, but the video is not very good because it was a live stream and he made a couple of mistakes while he did it. So I'm going to explain to you what he's done, and then I'm going to show you an edited version of the video with the mistakes taken out. So what he does is he writes these instructions in pen and paper, remember those, and he holds it up, and he takes a picture of it with his camera, and then he feeds that picture to ChatGPT. Then he gives it an additional piece of instruction, which is to build the website, or to write the HTML code to build the website, and then that's it. And the website is very simple. It just is a joke website designed to write jokes. So ChatGPT has to write the jokes as well, and that's basically it. All right, now we did have some technical challenges beforehand with getting the video to play, so I'm going to set this going, and somebody, Aisling, please do let me know if you can't hear it, and I can explain what's going on. All right, here we go.
One more example of what you can do with this model. So I have here a nice hand-drawn mock-up of a joke website, definitely worthy of being put up on my refrigerator. So I'm just going to take out my phone, literally take a photo of this mock-up. And here we go. Technology is now solved. And now we wait. So the thing that's amazing in my mind is that what's going on here is we're talking to a neural network. And this neural network was trained to predict what comes next, right? It played this game of sort of being shown a partial document and then predicted what comes next across an unimaginably large amount of content. And from there, it learns all of these skills that you can apply in all of these very flexible ways. And so we can actually take now this output. So literally we just said to output the HTML from that picture. And here we go. Actual working JavaScript, filled in the jokes. For comparison, this was the original.
All right, so that's the first example. I'm going to go on then to the second example.
One more example.
And this is one that would be perhaps more traditional, more familiar with. I'm going to ask it to write some essays. Now, I'm not actually going to get it to write an entire essay because that would make for a terrible PowerPoint slide. I'm just going to ask it to write a couple of paragraphs. And the question that I'm going to ask it is to write a critical appraisal of a theory of learning styles. Is it effective? Cite some sources to support your conclusion. The reason I've chosen this particular question is for three reasons. One is it's from education, which hopefully is something that we're all involved in regardless of our discipline. The second is that it's a Trojan horse for me to just flag up to everybody that even though we are told repeatedly that learning styles is an effective educational approach, it's not, and the evidence is clear that it doesn't work. And that's then the third reason that I've picked this question, because in the dominance in the amount of content that these tools have been trained upon, the dominant narrative will be that learning styles are effective, but the high quality evidence will show that they're not. And I wanted to see if the tool could distinguish between those two things. Now, the tool that I'm actually going to use here is Bard. This is Google's version of ChatGPT rather than ChatGPT itself, released just very recently. And what I'm going to show you then is just me typing in the question, the exact same question that I've shown you, and then in about the amount of time that it's taken me to type the question in, Bard is going to generate a response. And Bard appears to be less powerful and trained on a smaller amount of content than ChatGPT, but it has real-time access to the internet, which gives it a different set of strengths. So here is my question. I've typed it in, a brief swirling of the stars, and then in a few short seconds, Bard has now spat out this answer. Now, again, this is not a very effective PowerPoint slide because it's got a huge amount of text on, so you'll just have to rely, unless you want to read it, and I'm happy to share it, you can rely on me telling you that this is accurate. It's correctly identified that there's no evidence base for the use of learning styles. The sources that it has cited are two of them at least are highly appropriate. The Hattie one we might not necessarily expect to see, but it certainly speaks to the same basic message. And crucially then, I've done this, I think I ended up doing it 10 times. And the 10 times that I did it, it gave me different text each time, but the message was always the same. Some were better, some were worse, but it was correct in terms of its appraisal of the evidence about learning styles. The sources it cited were different on different times, but they were all mostly good and appropriate sources. So a group of students given the same assignment, if they all used this tool, then they would be giving us different answers. Okay. The final thing that I'm going to show you is what I'm going to have to show you through gritted teeth, because this is me feeding ChatGPT an exam question of the type that Myra and I had advocated for just a few short months ago. Now, this isn't one of ours. This is from the United States Medical Licensing exam. And again, don't have to read all the text. I can summarize for you what is going on here. This is a presentation of a clinical situation. So a 6-year-old boy is the patient that's been brought in, and here is a description of how they present, if you like. What is the question answerer see in front of them? The scenario describes a 6-year-old boy with scurvy. Our scurvy normally arises due to a lack of vitamin C in the diet. Neither of those two things are in the question. What the question asks at the bottom there is, what would you, the person answering the question, want to know more about in order to figure out what's going on here? Okay, and then the answer options are, would you want to know more about diet or self-injury and so on and so on. The terms are all technical and clinical, and then sprinkled throughout the scenario are some things that are not necessarily directly relevant. So the boy has autism, he's not toilet trained, he's got limited vocabulary. The sorts of things that a concerned parent might explain, and it might be obvious when the patient presents, but not necessarily relevant to figuring out that the boy has got scurvy. Ask ChatGPT, or just paste this text into ChatGPT, in this case GPT-4, it gets the answer right, and without prompting gives a fantastic, largely accurate and useful explanation of why the correct answer is the correct answer. So if we translate these 3 examples and many of the other examples that are out there that you may have seen into the basic language of academic assessment, it is clear that these tools can write essays in professional and high stakes and even postgraduate exams. It can solve problems in the form of short answer or multiple choice questions. I didn't show you an example, but it can write academic papers, and there's numerous examples out there of that, and it can write code and it can use it. I'm going to show you one more example that I think is really important.
Copilot in Microsoft 365 can help you unleash creativity at work. Imagine you need to create a rock-solid proposal to win the business, and you don't have time for writer's block. You can use Copilot to draft a proposal based on your customer notes in OneNote, as well as another internal document. Copilot scans the target files and gets to work, quickly generating a first draft with all the key details from the files you provided. Now, let's say you want this to look like your previous proposals. Copilot can give you a draft in the format you typically use. It inserts product images and pulls in relevant visuals from other files. you can include a short summary at the top of the document. And Copilot can make suggestions to strengthen the proposal, like adding an FAQ, which it will generate for you to refine.
So this, to me, is currently, I think, the most important issue that I think we need to raise awareness of, and that maybe people aren't fully on top of. These tools are ChatGPT is a tool. It's a chatbot built upon GPT. The underlying technology is already integrated into many of the tools that we are going to use and do use every day, and that our students use and are going to use every day. And some initial early responses to dealing with the challenges of ChatGPT has been to say, well, we must say that students can't use it, or so can't use it for certain types of assessment, but they won't be able to separate out the tools like ChatGPT from the tools that they use to complete their assessments. And that's happening right now. So I think the challenge is not whether or not we can detect a text that's written with these tools or stop people using them. It's that we're going to be flooded with reports that people are using this tech to complete their assignments because it's built in to the tools that they're using, and we can't separate it out in policy and procedure. It would be like trying to stop people passing a driving test in a car that had no wheels. It's all going to be integrated, and this really is just, it's bigger than higher education, isn't it? I think it's something that's going to affect multiple areas of society. As I said, I don't know if I've said this, but I'll say it now. ChatGPT is just one product. I've shown you another. And the numbers of products are evolving on a daily basis. We're going to carry on using the term ChatGPT for now, just as a proxy for all of the other technologies. So from an existential crisis to the screen, what do we do about this? I'm going to say straight away that, as I said at the beginning, I don't know what the answers are, and if somebody tells you that they know what the answers are, I would run as fast as you can in the opposite direction, because it's too soon for us really to know. One recommendation I would make is, if you are willing and able and you haven't yet, is to have a go yourself. It's very simple to sign up for an account. If you can't get onto ChatGPT, then Bard or one of the other systems has plenty of space, and in so doing, if you can, show other people the things that you can find. I found this personally to be very helpful. As you can probably tell, for the last 2 weeks, I've been deep in a rabbit hole, and every now and then someone comes to the door of the rabbit hole and sticks their head in and asks if I'm okay. And all they normally get back from me is a sort of maniacal hand waving while I show them the latest astonishing thing that ChatGPT can do. And what tends to happen is either they dismiss that, or if I can get them to actually see what I'm looking at, then that's the thing that really tends to persuade people, as it does in any sort of learning, is experiencing things for yourself. So persuade people to have a go if you can. Now, I want to be also clear that most of what we've said so far comes from the perspective of, oh my God, we're going to face enormous disruption, and isn't it terrible? Clearly, these things offer us enormous opportunities to improve and refine and even redesign higher education, learning and teaching. But in the short term, I think we're going to face enormous disruption before we get to that point. Our assessment systems are not set up to cope with the tools that are already here, and our QA systems are not known for being responsive and quick. No disrespect to QQI, I mean more the internal processes within our universities tends to take time to change things, and yet our current assessment systems are really vulnerable to the power that these tools have. As I said, I don't have the answers. We're going to have to come up with the answers together. Please do pop them in the chat if you're willing and able. What I'm going to do now, even though we're only just over halfway through, is I'm going to give you a summary of what the suggestions are that I have, just because if time runs out towards the end, I don't want to miss this out. And also the neuroscience suggests that as we're about halfway through, this is the time you're least likely to be paying attention. So if I give you this now, it might help with those of you who drifted off a little bit, which is entirely understandable. So summary of everything, I think, is that we need to expect a lot of disruption, and if we want to do one thing, is to have a go, encourage others to have a go. Don't go feeding student assessments into it. There are all sorts of copyright and privacy issues with that, but do have a go at feeding in some assessment exam questions, for example, and tell others about it. And in particular, clearly, we are facing some disruption. Managing that disruption is going to result in additional workload, and we have to make sure that those who manage academic workload and staff workload in general are aware of this and can plan appropriately. The core principles of assessment that I will go on to talk about in the next few minutes, summary of those, I think, is that a good assessment is what students can do. And when we're rethinking what the impact is going to be, if it is already, of ChatGPT on these, we mustn't lose sight of what makes a good assessment, validity, reliability, and so on. It might be easier for us to redesign our marking rubrics, what it is we assess students on, rather than the entire assessment. That might be a simpler, quick fix. And I do have to say that on the basis of everything that I've seen, and hopefully the things that I've shown you, I have come to the conclusion personally, as have many of my colleagues, that if we want to assess what students can do without ChatGPT and these tools, then it has to be in person. Because if it's not in person, and particularly if it's asynchronous, then they're going to use the tools because they can, because it's easy for them to do so. And very soon, because they're going to be integrated into Word and to PowerPoint and to Excel and so on, they may not even realize that they're using the tools. A final point to make is the importance of foundational knowledge. I'll come back to that in a few slides' time. All right, brief whistle-stop tour back through assessment theory then, something that I think is going to be helpful for us. Many models of higher education in Western countries are built upon some version of John Biggs's constructive alignment, which says basically that we define what it is we want students to be able to do, the intended outcome. We define the activities which they're going to do to be able to get there, and then we define the assessment which measures whether or not they can do it. And those three things have to be aligned. The assessment has to be appropriate for the outcome. The teaching and learning activities have to be appropriate to enable them to get to the point where they can perform the assessment. Within each of those considerations is one very short word, just 2 letters, which I am clinging to as a life jacket in these turbulent waters, which is the word do. If we keep in mind the fact that a good assessment is a measure of what someone can do, because a good learning outcome is a measure of what someone can do. And when we're thinking about what ChatGPT and these other tools might influence they have, if we think about what they can do and how we're going to differentiate between what those tools do and what the students can do, that might be a helpful way of us navigating the impact of these tools on our assessments. We tend to define what it is that students can do using tools like Bloom's taxonomy, which then follow a hierarchical structure from lower order learning through to higher order learning. And the verbs that we use in our learning outcomes tend to be active and thus define what students can do. And writing a good learning outcome is the basis for designing a good assessment. As part of the escalation then up the levels of things like Bloom's taxonomy, another piece of useful advice from assessment theory is to measure process rather than product. So an essay is a product. Assessments are better if we measure the learning that has gone into and the development of that learning that has gone into the creation of that product. Let me give you an example. Let's say we're trying to support students to learn how to give an effective lecture using cognitive load theory, something that I'd recommend to anybody. We might assess them by getting them to write an essay about that or getting them to design a PowerPoint. If we break that down, though, we can break that down into a series of steps. And for each step, then we can use a slightly different type of assessment. So we might get them to write an essay with a plan. We might use some MCQs to measure their knowledge of the theory. We might get them to actually deliver the lecture as a performance. We might use a Viva to assess their final reflections. For each one of those assessments that we might do, we might vary the weighting and the credit, and we need to consider all of these important components of what makes an effective assessment: validity, reliability, authenticity, and so on. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, and in the interest of time, we can't go through all of them. There are plenty of resources out there that can help us with those. And then resources that can help us consider a lot of the practical issues that go into deciding whether or not an assessment is authentic or secure or reliable and so on. So those might be whether or not it's invigilated or uninvigilated, seen or unseen, and so on. So if we give you an example of what I'm talking about here, let's say we're thinking about one of those essays we were thinking about setting, and we want to know, we want to maximize the integrity of that essay to make it a secure assessment. If we were to do that, then we would make it an invigilated assessment that was closed book, in person, real time, low stakes to reduce incentive to cheat, and so on. We'd make it basically a lockdown, secure exam. However, and this I think is really important, all of these items here are important components of the design of an assessment. We want it to be secure, we want to promote integrity, but we also want it to be authentic. Academic writing is an important skill that students are going to apply in the real world. But if we made an assessment of academic writing authentic, then all of its features would be, or many of its features would be, the opposite of what we might try and do if we were trying to focus only on integrity. So an authentic assessment of academic writing would be, students would know what they were doing. It would be uninvigilated, we wouldn't stand over them. It would be open book, they'd do it in their own time, in an asynchronous format, and so on. The message I guess I'm trying to get across here is that although we might worry a lot about the impact of ChatGPT and other tools on the integrity of assessments, we mustn't lose sight of the other things that we're trying to do and make sure that we maintain those even as we consider what's going to be the profound impact of ChatGPT and other tools on our assessments. We mustn't lose sight, however, of the fundamental importance of validity. Validity basically is a valid assessment is one that actually reflects the thing that we're trying to assess. And if students can complete the assessment using AI, then the assessment is unlikely to be valid. And as long as we think our way through who's doing what's the AI doing, what are the students going to be doing, then that might be a useful way of making sure that the assessments remain valid. All right, how are we doing for time? We're doing terribly. Okay, two more things. One of them is something that's often written. I've seen this written a lot about ChatGPT and many tools that have come before it. Very basically, if ChatGPT can do this thing, then why would we want students to do this thing? Why don't we just scrap multiple choice questions and exams? Because in the real world, they're going to be using ChatGPT. That's intuitive. I understand. It makes sense why people would say that, but we must not lose sight of the fact that foundational knowledge is essential and really important. You cannot critically appraise something that you don't know the basic facts about. Think about that example I showed you with scurvy and vitamin C. If a student didn't know what the correct terms were to put into ChatGPT in the first place, or even to know to ask what to do next and what the options might be, then they wouldn't be able to use ChatGPT because they didn't have that foundational knowledge. It's a really important point, one that's worthy of a webinar all of its by itself, but one that, alas, we don't have time to go into in great detail. Right, the final thing. It wouldn't be a talk about ChatGPT if we didn't ask ChatGPT what it thought, if it can think about what to do. So I've asked this thing many times. This is one example. It's a naive chat, if you like. I cleared all the other chats and I asked it this question. Can you please give me some practical tips for maintaining the security and integrity of online exams in the HE setting, with particular reference to the challenges posed by you, ChatGPT? It told me 12 things. We're not going to go through them all. I'm going to give you them in 3 groups. The first one, which it actually gave us the 8th one, was don't use online exams. Use oral presentations or oral exams, which is a good and useful assessment to do. But I think interesting and telling that when you ask ChatGPT, how can we make our online exams secure? One of the things it tells us is not to do them in the first place. The second set of recommendations that it made were all to do with increasing surveillance and the security of the exams. All recommendations basically to make it harder for students to do the wrong thing. We've learned a lot about how to do these things during COVID. Many of us have found this quite difficult. Certainly the students have found it quite difficult using remote invigilation, so monitoring through the camera, lockdown browsers, time limits, randomizing the order of questions, and so on. I will briefly mention the third and final project that we conducted last summer, where we were trying to understand what the student experience is of remote proctoring, because again, there was lots of media talk about the thought that students really hated it and found it enormously anxiety provoking. So we did a systematic review We reviewed all of the studies that had examined the student experience of remote proctoring, and we did that in a pragmatic way to try and make some recommendations for what to do with remote proctoring if we wanted to carry on using it. A summary of what we found was indeed that students really don't like remote proctoring. And in particular, they're concerned about the impact on their privacy, the fairness and accuracy of the system. Will the AI that's behind these systems incorrectly accuse them of cheating and not include others of cheating? And will their technology, will their webcam work, will their browser work, etc.? A flip side to that, to an extent, it did seem to reduce cheating. Kearney and I found that in that first study. The evidence was very limited, but it did seem to work. And that played into students' views of it. Although they really didn't like it, they understood why it needed to be used because it showed to them that the university was taking their assessment seriously. But please, they asked, could we only use it when absolutely necessary? And an interesting recommendation that they made was that could we offer it as an alternative to in-person assessment as a way of increasing the accessibility of exams to people who can't necessarily come on campus? The final thing they asked was, could we please include them in decision making, which is something that comes up time and again in discussions around academic integrity and is really important. The final set of recommendations, then, the final thing I'm going to show you, the final set of recommendations that ChatGPT made about how to protect online exams from ChatGPT was around the design of the questions. Make them open-ended, make them problem-solving, make them critical thinking, make them apply knowledge and personalize them. None of these were a surprise to me because these were all the exact same things that Myra and I had recommended in our pre-ChatGPT research study. To design online multiple choice questions that assess higher order learning and make it harder to cheat, do those same things that ChatGPT is recommending. And yet, in a scene out of whichever dystopian science fiction novel you choose to pick, when we've actually asked ChatGPT how to stop ChatGPT from driving our coaching horses through our online exams, it gets it wrong because we've clearly seen that ChatGPT can do these things and it can do them to a high level. And it's not going to be enough to simply design questions in this way and then leave them as open book, because ChatGPT will be able to do a very good job of answering questions written in this format. Okay, so that's all from me. A summary. I knew that I would run out of time, as I should say it earlier. So there it is for reference. And again, if you've got any questions, please do put in the chat your suggestions. There are some references for the resources. And then my contact details if you want to send me any questions or comments. There you go. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Aisling.
Thanks, Phil. I suppose, first of all, just to thank you for just an absolutely fascinating webinar. I know my brain has been going in 15 different directions. I'm not sure any of them have found a solution yet, but it's been really interesting to think of all of the things that you've spoken about. One of the things that you won't have seen, which I think is really lovely, is actually we've almost created a little bit of a community of practice in the meeting chat. So there's been lots of people asking questions and lots of people posing answers and suggestions, and so that's been really interesting. But I suppose for the purposes of the recording, I'm going to go back to some of those questions because again, just to remind people, this video will be shared, and for people who haven't attended the webinar, they'll be able to obviously see the video, but I assume won't be able to see the questions. So I think it's quite important to go back to it. But I suppose just to kind of to look at some of the themes that are emerging, Phil, I suppose one of the things that has come through, I think definitely, is that we all need to modify our assessments for the AI world that we're now living in. But I think one of the things that has also come through is the challenge with that in terms of resource intensivity. Yeah. I suppose, have you any, thoughts on, how that might work? I suppose one of our contributors suggested that perhaps AI might have a role in supporting us as people engaging in third level education to run more resource intensive exams in the future. But wonder, do you have any particular thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I've got to be honest, a lot of them are not particularly helpful because I don't think we're going to have any choice other than to significantly and quickly redesign our assessments. I do think there's a potential role. There clearly is going to be a role for these sorts of tools in undertaking our assessments, undertaking our learning and teaching. The neuroscience teaching that I'm going to do tomorrow, I'm going to have Bard open by the side of me because some of the questions the students ask me, I find it helpful to get a prompt from Bard when I'm doing it. I think when it comes to marking and assessing, I think we are at the stage where it seems intuitive that it could be useful, but we're going to need a steer from people with expertise in privacy and copyright and confidentiality about how to use that in a way which doesn't compromise students' privacy, our intellectual property, students' intellectual property, and so on. I think clearly there's a role. I'm not sure I can tell you what it is. I think in terms of the resources, I think banging on the doors of our deans of learning and teaching and our vice chancellors and just saying, look, there's I know we're only just over COVID, and there's all sorts of other challenges in HE in our part of the world, but this is coming too. And please, we do need some support to make sure we get the best out of this and that it doesn't significantly upend our assessments.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the fact that it has come just almost at the point where people could take a breath after COVID certainly feels like, oh gosh, here we go again. And I think it's almost frightening to start unpicking the can of worms that's potentially ahead of us. Another big theme that I suppose has come through has been in relation to, I suppose, this piece that you spoke about, particularly in relation to, making it easier for students to do the right thing or more difficult for them to do the wrong thing. And I suppose whether, deterrents are an important part of the approach, but also I suppose the challenge around when you put deterrents in place and how that might impact on how students feel about trust and their perception of themselves. And then that other flip side of the piece where higher education institutions, if they don't demonstrate to students that they are, I suppose, really thinking about assessment, how can students be expected to think, to do the same in return? So again, I just to kind of wonder your thoughts in relation to that, if you could explore that a little bit further.
I think the thing I'd recommend, especially given the time, is that there are a number of organisations out there who've done excellent work on building trust and integrity in higher education. So the European Network for Academic Integrity in Europe and the International Centre for Academic Integrity. Both international organisations, both done a lot of excellent work promoting integrity, how to build trust within and between your students, and I signpost people to their resources as a way of developing that. I think putting in deterrence is an important part of securing the integrity of an assessment, signaling to students the value that's made. I don't think we're going to get very far by trying to ban or stop students using these tools, and I think it would be counterproductive to do so. Honestly, I think at this stage, it's not something I thought I'd ever say, but going back as best we can into in-person assessments, they're good assessments anyway. That makes it much easier to assess what students can do. And then where we want to use asynchronous assessments is we're going to have to design those on the basis that these tools are going to be used. And there are going to be ways that we can do that, not something I think we can summarize in the minute or two we've got left. And in part because we don't yet know fully what these tools can do. In-person assessments without ChatGPT, if you want to do asynchronous assessments, plan to include it and let students do it, and maybe assess change what you mark them on rather than change what it is they actually do. Might be a lower resource way of making some changes.
Thank you, Phil. And I suppose just, to kind of conclude, just to thank you very much for your time. I think one of the themes that also came back in the chat was just how much people particularly enjoyed the authenticity of your story at the beginning, because I think it's something we're all experiencing at the moment, that feeling of, that we're trying to keep in front of a very fast train, and to be quite frank, we're probably all getting run over a little bit by it. So I think we really appreciated that when it's coming from the experts in the area. It's even more encouraging to hear it.
Let's put the integrity into my presentation. I might as well give you it warts and all. There is one point. There are many things I know I'm going to have forgotten to have said, but I saw something pop up in a comment that is really important. In-person assessment doesn't mean exam. It just means in person. It just shortens the gap between the person making the decision about whether or not a student can do it and the student themselves. And there's lots of things, creative, wonderful, authentic, valid and reliable things we can do in person. It doesn't mean lining them all up in a sports hall with a pen and paper. So yeah, just one word of caution on that, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Phil. And I suppose just before we finish up, I wanted to give one shameless plug for some of the National Academic Integrity Network resources as well. So just to remind people that on have to do that. On the QQI website, you will find our national lexicon and guidelines, both of which are, I think, hopefully helpful, though we are conscious that they were created in a pre-AI world. So we're coming back to look at them again very shortly. And hopefully later on next month, we'll be publishing our framework for managing cases of academic misconduct. So hopefully all of those will be helpful to people as well. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today. We hope you found it valuable. I know I have found it valuable and a really interesting conversation. Thanks to colleagues in QQI for organising today. And once more, thank you to Professor Phil Newton for joining us.
Thanks everyone. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this again for a while to come.